8. Improvisations. STS Central, Olympus Mons. The pain was his friend, keeping him alert in the face of the drugs. Dogface had overridden the medical expert system that stood by the all-body brace to reduce the doses, but he was frightened of going too far. He could feel his central nervous system wavering back and forth between agony and euphoria. As he tried to concentrate on monitoring the network, his thoughts would veer away in unexpected directions, accelerating into bands of bright primary colour or crashing through walls of glass into diamond-studded darkness. Once, the network had shrunk down to a spider's web of glittering lines that he felt he could hold in the palm of his hand. It was a tremendous high, but he doubted that it would catch on. The equipment was too expensive for one thing. When the system's crash blacked out the control room, he managed to get some data by bypassing the main signalling subsystem and routing through one of the TV channels. He chose Welsh 12 because he figured no one watched it, not even the Welsh. He'd tried shunting the feed up to the control room, but he kept running into blocks. Someone had deliberately isolated STS Central's command network. Jacked in through the plug in his index finger, Dogface could feel the whole network running down. Trains were halting by platforms as on-board emergency systems shut down in response to the loss of power. Backup power generators at isolated stations came online like little novas. The daily commuter scramble that usually ran ahead of the dateline on Terra toppled over like a breaking wave and became a wash of stranded individuals. He wondered if he was watching the end of civilization. There were things moving about in the system. Dogface could track them by the spikes in the power lines. Some, he thought, must be the virus program, other various subsets of the network intelligence. Most were converging on Arcturus Terminal and the Stunnel Gateway. There was activity at the other end of the system too, at Lowell Depot. His own drones were involved in it somehow. He felt he might have authorized their use to Yak Harris, but he couldn't remember. A voice called his name in perfect Mandarin. A Chinese princess stood by his brace, beautiful in a silk shampoo embroidered with twisting dragons in silver thread. Yang Chu, she called him, using his given name, one he hadn't heard since the war. When he looked closely, there was a nimbus of light around her perfect face. "Have you come to take me to heaven?" asked Dogface. "Fuck no," said Ming. "But I wouldn't mind some of whatever it is you're on." Ming traced her hand along the top of the expert system. There was a panic button there, a switch to override his override. If she pressed that, the expert system would shut him down until he felt better. About a week, Dogface estimated. At least. "I've got this problem, Yang Chu," said Ming. "All the other floozies are over at Arcturus Station with half an arsenal, waiting for God knows what to turn up. Now, I'm not saying they won't make it, but if they don't, I won't have no one to do what I tell them and fix the network. The Seoul transit system will collapse, billions will starve, and the bottom will fall out of the stock market, taking my investments with it." Ming smiled down at him, and Dogface saw for the first time ever that Ming really was a princess. "Somebody has to live," said Ming, "and that somebody is you." She pressed the panic button. Dogface felt himself sink into the waters of oblivion. Lowell Depot. Ahmed had just managed to sit down when Deirdre called him. He propped himself against a wall in the freight depot and watched the military load up their hardware onto the flatbeds. The military, the NGOs and the police were pulling out of the stop. A captain from the project police had briefed him on contingency plans in case of stragglers. The captain had scraped back hair and tired eyes. Ahmed's foreman brought them glasses of sweet tea, and they'd gone over the white prints together. Ahmed was a great believer in gathering local knowledge before he started a job. The captain left along with the last contingent of police, leaving Ahmed and his team alone in the deserted projects. At least, Ahmed hoped they were alone. Just in case, he made sure that his people worked in pairs, fanning out into the projects with the survey drones. Their job was to take precise structural measurements and compare them to the white prints stored in Ahmed's portable console. He usually used this lull to collect his thoughts before tackling any problems. A couple of moments now could save him hours, even days later. And as his wife Ming always said, time is money and sleep an investment. The communicator pinned to the lapel of his caftan beeped. It was Deirdre, his shift supervisor. "Yes." "Boss," said Deirdre, "I think you'd better come and have a look at something." "What is it?" "I don't know," said Deirdre. That worried Ahmed. Deirdre considered herself the real driving force within the company and affected to regard Ahmed as an overpaid supernumerary who was only kept on because he was co-married to the chairman's wife. If Deirdre was passing the buck upwards, then it had to be serious. "Where are you?" asked Ahmed. "The main passenger platform." "I'm on my way." Ahmed got to his feet and walked up the narrow connecting corridor to the passenger platforms. One of his crew had wedged the security door open with a block of wood. Deirdre met him on the other side, a small, bulky woman wearing baggy rhino-hide dungarees and a new Jamaica t-shirt that was pulled tight around her heavy breasts. She pointed down the platform. "Who authorised that?" asked Ahmed. The ugliest tank engine he'd ever seen was standing at the platform. "Not me, boss," said Deirdre. "I tried contacting STS Central, but the link's dead." A freshly welded patch covered most of the nose, including the forward windscreen. It gave the engine a blind, stupid look. "Anyone get out?" "Not yet," said Deirdre. "Did you look inside?" "I thought I'd call you first." "There might be people inside," said Ahmed. "They could be hurt." "After you, boss," said Deirdre. The tank engine had another fresh patch, where the emergency cabin door should have been. Ahmed peered into the cabin through the one unbroken window. "What can you see?" called Deirdre, who'd stayed at the end of the platform. "Is there anyone in there?" "I can't see anyone, but it's pretty messed up in there," said Ahmed. Most of the cabin instrumentation was dead. There was what might have been evidence of small arms damage. "What are you waiting for?" he called to Deirdre. "No way I'm going anywhere near that thing," Deirdre shouted back. "I've heard stories." "What kind of stories?" "Ghost stories," said Deirdre. "About the Black Train." "Since when?" "Since yesterday," said Deirdre. That's always been the problem with information technology, thought Ahmed. Instant myths. There was a hiss from the rear section of the tank engine, and its big cargo doors swung outwards. Ahmed took a couple of steps backwards just in case. A drone came through the open doors at chest height, with a 1,000-metre drum of electrical cable suspended from its belly mandibles. 3 more drones followed, each carrying crates of heavy equipment. Deirdre jumped quickly out of the way as they whirred up the platform towards her. The cargo doors swung shut, and the tank engine's turbine coughed into life. Ahmed heard it cycle up to half power and watched as the tank engine reversed out of the station. He turned and ran after the drones. "Come on," he told Deirdre as he passed her. The first drone stopped at the crash barrier. It was unpacking its crates with its forward arms. The front end of a hologram projector was beginning to emerge from one of the crates. It was a big one, the kind used for stadiums. "Hey, drone," said Ahmed. "What are you doing?" The drone ignored him and extended manipulators with Waldos as fine as human hair. Ahmed looked for identification flashes and saw a row of pictograms spaced along its access panel. "Korean," said Deirdre. "What do they say?" "It's the gardener from Peihai Park," said Deirdre. "It's a long way from the Forbidden City," said Ahmed. "Where did the others go?" "Into the hole at the end of the station." Ahmed walked over and looked into the hole. The electrical cable had been laid along the left wall, held against the rock with hooped steel staples at 3-metre intervals. "What's the loading on a cable like that?" asked Ahmed. "About a gigawatt," said Deirdre. "At least." "I knew that," said Ahmed. I just wanted to be sure that you knew that. They followed the cable into the hole. Deirdre pulled the billy lamp and gave the passage a professional once-over. "This should have collapsed," she said. "I wonder what's holding it up." There were duckboard ramps laid over the vertical maintenance shaft that bisected the hole. Deirdre let Ahmed cross them first, to test the weight, she said. "I knew this was going to be a bad week," said Ahmed, "when I heard the president was dead." "The president's dead?" asked Deirdre. "You didn't know?" "I don't keep track of politics," said Deirdre. "Don't you watch TV? Read the facts?" "What for?" asked Deirdre. "I've got better things to do with my spare time than read facts." "To learn important things," said Ahmed, "like the president being killed." "I didn't vote for him," said Deirdre. The power cable came to an end in a mess of equipment that stood in the centre of a natural cavern. The 3 remaining drones were clustered around the mess, manipulators working fast enough to blur. An assembly was taking shape between them. At first, Ahmed thought it was a data-gathering probe, but the feed cables were too robust for data transmission. They looked more like the cables you'd use to hook up a big drilling laser. Beyond the assembly was something like a blue door set into the cavern wall. There was white lettering above the door which said "Police Box" in English. The business end of the assembly was definitely aimed directly at the door. The important question, Ahmed realised, was which way would the power go? Would the assembly collect power from the doorway, or would it be pumped at it? Whichever way it went, judging from the insulation, it was going to be in the megawatt range. "What the hell is this supposed to be?" asked Deirdre. "Bad news," said Ahmed. "Really bad news." Arcturus Terminal, Stunnel Terminus. They were watching the sensors go dead along the central line one by one. "Christ in a bucket," said Lambada in admiration. "That sucker is fast." "When they get here," said Dogface, "you can ask them how it works." "They ain't gonna get here," said Old Sam, "because I'm going to close down the extension gateway before they do." "Can you do that?" asked Blondie. "I built that gateway, boy," said Old Sam, "and I always put in a backdoor override." "You shut it down when they're in the tunnel, Sam, and they'll disassociate," said Credit Card. "That's what I'm counting on," said Old Sam. "There'll be an energy plume," said Lambada. "Good," said Old Sam. "Then we'll know we got them." "Yeah," said Credit Card. "We'll be right in front of it." "I'm too young to glow in the dark," said Lambada. "So we stand either side," said Old Sam. "Sounds reasonable," said Credit Card. "Only because we've all gone mad," said Lambada. "How long have we got?" asked Blondie. 90 seconds, said Credit Card. "Everybody take cover," said Old Sam. They turned their back on the central line gateway and went back to the barricades, each of them walking in as casual manner as possible. "My contract never said anything about alien monsters," said Credit Card. "Standard general maintenance contract, that's what I signed." "Mine did," said Old Sam. "No shit. Mine had a clause about pest control," said Lambada. "What about yours, Blondie?" "I couldn't read mine," said Blondie. "The small print was all in Chinese." "How long?" asked Lambada. 45 seconds, said Credit Card. "If I'd known this was going to happen, I'd have asked for a bonus clause." The barricades formed a metre-high semicircle 10 metres out from the Stunnel gateway. There were no gaps, so they had to climb over. Old Sam vaulted over in a single fluid movement, body metabolism already accelerating under the influence of a shot of Doberman. Lambada hadn't objected this time. "If I had known," said Old Sam, "I'd have been a watchmaker." "A profound statement, Sam," said Lambada, "but intrinsically meaningless." 35, said Credit Card. Blondie hunkered down in his assigned place. Old Sam had left a pulse rifle for him, propped up against the barricade. Blondie took the rifle and laid it across his knees. 20 seconds, said Credit Card. "I suppose it's too late to put in for some sick leave?" asked Lambarda. Much too late, said old Sam. Olympus Mons. Central Line. Cadiatu, the train indicator had said, her name flashing up in half-metre holographic letters 30 seconds after the doctor had gone. What? She had screamed down the platform. Wait, said the indicator, and she'd waited. If it mentions making a sacrifice for the children, thought Cadiatu, I'm going to shoot it. Fat Mama, 1 min. Now it's getting personal, thought Cadiatu. 1 minute later, a wrecked tank engine pulled into the station, steam leaking from a ruptured cooling valve at the back. The cabin hatch was welded over with a patch, but the cargo doors opened when they drew level with Cadiatu. She looked up at the indicator hologram. Straight to hell. Been there, said Cadiatu as she climbed aboard. Done that. Actuurus Terminal, Stunnel Terminus. The scariest thing was that Blondie could see right through the side of the black train. Through its semi-transparent bulkhead, he could make out the shadowy form of dozens of cake monsters curled up on tiers inside. Old Sam's cut-off hadn't worked. The Central Line gateway had stayed open, and the black train had come screaming into the station. No one had a chance to ask Old Sam what had gone wrong, because the train had ploughed into the barricades. Blondie didn't see it, but he thought Lambarda and Credit Card might have jumped clear in time. Almost before it stopped, the train started to de-res, patches of transparency racing across the hull like oil slicks over water. Inside the train, the cake monsters were squirming, struggling to get free of the rapidly disintegrating train. Blondie saw Johnny Ray's sweaty face in his mind's eye, freezing up under the violet skies of Mars. Not me, thought Blondie. I ain't no Johnny Ray. I'm not the grunt that can't. He snapped the pulse rifle around and emptied a clip into the side of the train. The bullets ripped through the degenerating hull and exploded amongst the squirming cake monsters, bright flashes throwing up gouts of red and blue. As if opening fire was a signal, Blondie heard the snap of Old Sam's drones as they detached themselves from the ceiling, and the drill sound as they opened up with their miniguns. The roof of the black train was swallowed up in a ripple of yellow explosions, the whole top tier of cake monsters underneath simply disintegrating. Black, greasy smoke boiled upwards and spread across the ceiling. Blondie stopped firing and fumbled for his respirator with his left hand, trying to get it settled over his mouth. The first shot came out of the smoke and slammed into his chest, knocking him onto his back. The second shot ripped the air over his head. He fired wildly back, the recoil hurting his arms and pushing him along the floor. A wave of grey smoke was rolling over him, and through it Blondie could see shadows stalking towards him. He stayed on his back and changed the rifle clip, just in time to shoot a cake monster in the chest as it loomed over him. Then another one, running in from his left. Blondie wanted to get up, didn't want to be caught on his back, but the cake monsters kept on coming. His world was narrowing down to a 1 metre circle of visibility, the shudder of the rifle in his hands and the shapes that came out of the smoke. A dull roar made Blondie look upwards. Above him, an explosion created a bubble of flame in the smoke. He could see half a drone silhouetted by the light. The burning drone seemed to grow larger at an astonishing rate. There was a prickling heat sensation on the exposed skin of his face. Blondie threw himself to the side, rolling away as a twisted wreck crashed into the floor. A severed manipulator arm gouged a groove just in front of his face, and shrapnel clattered off the armour on his back. He felt something take the skin off the back of his left hand. That was one of Old Sam's, thought Blondie. They shot down one of Old Sam's drones. What are these things? He realised that he'd lost the pulse rifle and climbed to his knees to look for it, but it was useless. The station was completely filled with smoke. To his right, the burning drone was a flickering glow. Occasionally shadows would flick in front of it. He could hear shots and bangs around him, but nothing seemed that close. Ahead, he saw a spinning bronze disc shining through the smoke. The Stunnel Gateway. Crouching low to avoid stray bullets, Blondie worked his way towards it. That's what they were supposed to be defending. He came across the X by accident, stumbling over something soft hidden in the smoke. It was formed out of 2 strips of fluorescent yellow gaffer tape stuck to the floor. It was right in front of the gateway and about 5 meters out. Blondie wondered what it was for. Central Line. The Doctor had a sinking feeling that Kadiatu might be right, at least about the mechanics of free surfing and the inadvisability of riding aboard alone. The mental discipline wasn't hard. He adapted an old Gallifreyan flying mantra. The trick was in anticipating the gateways, riding the energy wave front as the board broke through the interface. It wasn't that different from sea surfing. The Doctor wished he'd paid attention when he'd been on that Australian beach. The problem was that the Doctor had just realised what the second person on a free surfing board did. They ran a contra mantra to set up feedback harmonies at the emerging tunnel gateway. In short, the second person handled the brakes. The Doctor estimated that he'd been doing 60 kilometres per hour at the last station, gaining 5 kilometres an hour with every stretch of tunnel. He hoped there was something soft at Arcturus terminal for him to run into, but he wasn't overly optimistic. The Doctor wasn't happy with his performance so far. Outmanoeuvred, outthought, shot at, abused and insulted by an enemy which was largely ignoring him. Getting drunk in a dockside taverna in Greece hadn't exactly been a brainwave either. Too many distractions, he thought. Too much introspection. And too much ouzo. What was on the other side of the gateway? Life didn't need to think. Life was just a coherent pattern in the environment, any environment. The Doctor could imagine an environment that was formed entirely out of interstitial pathways connected to nodes, an infinity of interconnected junctions like the hard wiring of a neural network. Life could evolve there because life made up its own rules as it went along and never knew when to stop. It would have to be in another dimension where the rules were different. There was a long, complex formula for determining just how far off base reality a dimension was, but the Doctor didn't need to do it. The dimension would have to be a very long way off indeed. The human race had gone and poked their finger right into the hornet's nest, meddling with forces that they had no understanding of, as per usual. They had punched a gateway by mistake from one dimension to another. And now the Doctor was here again, to rectify that mistake and swat the hornet. Providing there was something soft for him to collide with at Arcturus terminal. The hitchhiker was waiting in the next tunnel. The Doctor felt its ghost-like presence in the shifting harmonies of the interstitial webs that surrounded him. It couldn't communicate in any normal sense, but its desires were plain to the Doctor. It wanted to go where he was going. "Climb aboard," he said. "Always room for one more." There was a painful sense of pressure behind his eyes, and he hoped that it was purely psychosomatic. He hit the penultimate station at 200 kilometres an hour. The wind ripped at his clothes. "There were 8 in the bed," the Doctor sang to himself, and the little ones said, "Roll over, roll over." So they all rolled over and one fell out. The Doctor went into the last tunnel. Arcturus terminal, Stunnel terminus. Mariko kept Naren close to her where she could keep an eye on him. She had been feeling strangely dislocated since they'd hit the station. Inside the bright dojo other mind, the shoji doors had been slamming shut one by one. The bright colours behind them fading to a dull grey. Mariko didn't think she had long left. But that was okay. She'd had fun while it lasted. The plan had been simple and straightforward so far. Smash the black train through the barricades, kill everybody in the station. The first had been easy. The second was proving more difficult. The enemy had been better equipped than anticipated, and they'd used up a lot of Razvedka in the initial assault. They also had reinforcements in the Galeria. 2/3 of Mariko's force were engaged in keeping them out of the station. Her personal crew were trying to mop up the enemy in front of the tunnel gateway. In the thick smoke, the Razvedka had to rely on their sense of smell to find them. A shoji that had always stayed shut and displayed no symbol finally opened. The final knowledge flooded into Mariko's consciousness. Ah, thought Mariko. So that's the plan. It would have been easier, thought Benny, as she listened to the gunfire, just to poison everyone. She had suggested it as a course of action, but it didn't think like that. That level of subtlety seemed, like the threat of the doctor, beneath its comprehension. She'd pulled the veil and headdress off as soon as she'd closed the canteen's shutters, glad to get out of the restricting black clothes. She sat down on the kitchen floor, putting the solid width of the counter between her and any stray bullets. It wouldn't do to be taken out by accident. She checked her watch, an unnecessary action, given the way the plan was ticking away in her head. In any case, the symbols on its face had lost their meaning to her. It was time to get moving. Benny crawled through the connecting door and into the storage bay. A double line of food lockers were racked against both walls. She stood up and banged on the locker nearest the door. "Rise and shine," she said. "Up and at 'em." The locker door swung open to reveal 2 Razvedka curled up inside. One of them craned its neck to look at her. "Already?" it asked. "I was dreaming." "Everything is a dream," said Benny. "I thought you knew that." "There's dreams," said the Razvedka, "and there's dreams." "Get up," said Benny, "or we'll be late." The tunnel gateway shone like a sun, burning a corridor through the smoke. Mariko, with Naran at her shoulder, walked towards the light. There was still fighting to either side. Mariko's mind received impressions of the combat. To her right, a terrible figure in armour who moved like the wind and struck like thunder. The Razvedka that fought him were filled with admiration, even as they died. To the left, 2 of the enemy defended a tangle of broken metal, beating off repeated attacks by 2 crew's soldiers. Only one of the enemy was left defending the gateway, a man in dented half-armour, blonde hair backlit by the intense bronze light of the gateway. He held a long piece of twisted metal in both hands. Mariko could see blood drip down his wrists and onto the floor by his feet. When she was close enough to see his face, she smiled. The man flinched at the sight and raised his stick. Mariko thought she recognised the look in his eyes. Behind her, she felt Naran's body coiling up in readiness. "Morituri te saluton," she said. "Those about to die salute you." She was disappointed to see no trace of recognition on his face. Instead, his features seemed to fill up with a stupid kind of determination. There was nothing heroic in his expression, no semblance of valour or noble resolution, no sense of history. It was just a human being with a stick and a dumb refusal to get out the way. Naran leapt at him, 6-centimetre claws springing from his fingers. The blonde man swung his stick, knocking away Naran's first swing, jumping back to avoid the second. "Get on with it, Naran," shouted Mariko. "We haven't got all day." Naran stepped in under the man's reach and smashed the stick from his hands. His left hand swung in to rip the man's face off, but the man managed to grab the wrist. "He's good material," said Mariko. "See if you can salvage." Naran's prehensile tongue struck out at the man's face, fingertips snapping. The man had to fend it off with his remaining free hand, leaving his torso exposed. Naran stiffened his fingers and plunged his hand into the man's chest. It sank through armour and flesh all the way up to the wrist. Blondie heard himself scream as the hand sank into his chest. Automatically, he brought up his own hands to tear at the wrist. He could feel the seam at the site of the penetration. There was no pain, but the sensation of violation threatened to overwhelm his mind. He looked up and found himself looking into a pair of sad brown eyes. He tried to ask the creature why he was doing this, but his voice was no longer his own. There was still no pain, even as he felt fingers wrap around his beating heart. Only a sensation of warmth that began to spread from his chest. The world began to fade around Blondie. His vision faded until nothing was left except those eyes, so deep and full of an ancient sadness. The warmth spreading through his body made him drowsy. He began to think that dying wasn't so bad. It was more like drifting off to sleep. His hands fell back to hang loosely by his sides. The eyes expanded until all the world was a rich brown shot through with silver. Sound faded, the gunfire rushing away to become as insignificant as fireworks. "Come with us," said the silver streaks. "Put down your troubles, and we will fill you up with certainty." He let the warmth engulf him. A rose bloomed amongst the rich brown fields, its petals as black as midnight, its thorns the colour of African gold, as sharp as razors. The taste of gunpowder on his lips. The petals opened to reveal Kadiatu standing in the heart of the rose, as if she had grown from the same stem. Sunlight flowed across her naked body, making swirls of amber on her skin. He saw her breath colour through parted lips. The streaks of silver became angry and formed into sharp steel needles. The brown fields twisted until they became a cone-shaped vortex, the colour changing to the sickly pink of diseased gums. The needles spun in the vortex until they became grey blurs and contracted around the rose. Blondie saw that they would rip Kadiatu to pieces. "No!" he screamed. The real world snapped back. Blondie's heart beat weakly against the imprisoning fingers. Once. Twice. The cake monster's brown eyes blinked at him in sad astonishment. His heart beat twice more and stopped. Blondie felt the darkness enfold him, as soft and as silent as a fall of rose petals. Mariko watched the body fall to the ground as Naran withdrew. He stared at his hands for a moment, and then looked over at Mariko. Then, with an angry snort, he picked up the body and threw it away. Mariko could understand his anger. Like her, Naran was a bit of a perfectionist. She put a comforting hand on his shoulder, and together they walked to the gateway. They took up a defensive position beside the control equipment and waited. Benny walked in from the Galeria through a cone of violence. Around her, the Canteen Razvedka fought short, bloody combats to buy her passage. The KGB assault team had been concentrating on getting into the station. They hadn't expected an attack from the rear. The smoke boiled to either side, lurid flashes of colour as the fighting continued. The floor of the station proper was littered with wreckage, bodies and bits of bodies. Both sides were using explosive rounds, and their remains were difficult to tell apart. Mariko and Naran were waiting for her by the gateway. Close up to its spinning surface, Benny could almost feel reality tearing as the power poured in. Mariko had prepared the controls for her. Benny had only to tap in a single command sequence to initiate the tunnel. And then the future past that moment stretched away into darkness. She punched in the sequence, and the gateway began to open. Mariko and Naran moved before she did, reacting to the gust of wind that swept through the station. She thought it was the tunnel initiation, but the wind was at her back, parting the smoke like a curtain. Naran ran forward, both gun barrels pushing out of his palms. He came flying backwards, the metre-long ramming spike of Razvedka tunnel board protruding from his back. The board's momentum slammed him into the gateway. There was a flash of bright pink light as the torque forces ripped him limb from limb. Through the smoking air flew a figure, arms spread as if crucified. Benny realised that the board's passenger had jumped off when it emerged from the Central Line gateway at 200 kilometres per hour. The arms were spread to maximise wind resistance in a vain attempt to slow him down as he described a flat parabolic arc along the 200-metre length of the station. It was an insane, suicidal manoeuvre. The man was going to die for sure. At the last moment, the man snapped in his limbs and became a human cannonball, tumbling as it hit the ground. For a moment, Benny thought that the impact had literally exploded the man, that limbs and torso were being ripped apart. Then she saw that he was still intact, his body describing a convoluted series of twists in the air. As she watched him twist through the air, Benny wondered whether the doctor had any limitations at all. The doctor knew that the landing was crucial. You could lose a lot of points for a sloppy landing. You had to come down with your feet together and absorb the impact with your knees. It was a question of maintaining the correct line. Of course, you weren't supposed to be travelling quite as fast as he was, and the provision of a soft landing mat would have been nice. In the seconds before his feet touched the ground, he heard the conductor tap his baton on the lectern 3 times. The sound echoed through the orchestra pit of his mind. There was the poised hush from the musicians as they gripped their instruments. The fugue started the moment he hit the floor, appassionato, with passion, and this time without the mix-up with the printers. The themes were all there, but this time they worked in harmony. The flute solo that had spoken of patterns in energy was now backed by the strings, loud and grand. It had the slightly stilted artificial envelope of a synthesizer. The sampled percussion backbeat that the doctor realised represented the cake monsters was faltering, their place in the score fading. As he faced Benny, the doctor could hear the slow oboe wail of betrayal. But whose? "You're too late, Doctor," said Benny. The doctor ignored her for the moment and turned instead to the cake monster that stood at her side. "Don't I know you from somewhere?" The cake monster shrugged. "You can't stop us," said Benny. The doctor continued to ignore her. The violinists were reaching a climax, bows smoking across the strings of their instruments. He wasn't going to talk to Benny right now. He was waiting for her boss. The colour of the gateway was changing. Swirls of intense copper began to radiate from the hub. The doctor watched with interest. He'd never seen anything like this before. The actual egress was barely visible. The copper colour briefly covered the whole disk and then subsided. Only Benny really changed, and not physically either. Instead, the doctor got the impression that she was filled up to the brim with another intelligence. He half expected her skin to crack and leak light. The doctor gave it a few moments to integrate its personality. "How d'ye do?" he said. "I'm the doctor. I believe you already know my friend Bernice." "Intimately," said the thing inside Benny. "And who are you?" "The concept of personal pronoun is not applicable in these circumstances." "Fine," said the doctor. "In that case, I'll call you Fred." Lowell Depot. The survey crews had been sent off on an early and extended tea break. Ahmed didn't want them around when whatever happened, happened. Primarily because whatever was going to happen, it probably wasn't covered by the company's workplace insurance. Deirdre had a minicam trained on the weird assembly by the crash barrier. Others were placed to get a good view of the whole station, and she had remotes covering the cavern at the far end of the structural collapse. "What for?" he'd asked. Deirdre thought they might tape something worth selling to the bad news show. "Don't worry, boss," she'd said. "I'll cut you in for a percentage." The drone lay on its side by the assembly. As soon as its work had finished, it had drifted off slightly and just fallen out of the air. Whoever had been operating it obviously didn't need it anymore. Ahmed wondered if it was salvageable. Technically, it was within his contract area and fair game. He decided to check his legal database afterwards. Afterwards was the problem. The assembly looked like a huge holographic projector pointing down the station at the central line gateway. Except you didn't need gigawatt cabling for a projector, no matter how big it was. Ahmed looked over at Deirdre, who had produced an apple from somewhere and was polishing it casually on her dungarees. Are you sure we should be standing so... There was a click, and a huge subsonic hum like the biggest amplifier ever made being switched on. Ahmed turned back to the assembly just in time to be blinded by the light. It burst out of the projector in a single pulse of brilliant silver energy, shot through with sickly green streaks. It raced down the station and into the gateway. The subsonic hum clicked off, and the whole projector assembly collapsed, bursting into flames. "Did you see that?" shouted Deirdre. Ahmed blinked rapidly, but all he could see was one massive purple afterimage. He hoped to God that he hadn't blinded himself permanently. Eyeballs were bloody expensive these days. "I don't know where that was going," said Deirdre, "but I wouldn't want to be standing in front of it." Arcturus Terminal, Stunnel Terminus. A single sustained note from a trumpet, high and sweet, suspended above the rough chords of the main orchestra. Duke Ellington, thought the Doctor, and about time too. Kadiatu was coming. He could smell the violence. He looked down to check that he was standing on the cross of gaffer tape. X marks the spot. He shouldn't have long to wait now. "What do you want?" asked the Doctor, stalling. "That depends," said Benny Fred. "What do you want?" The cake monster with Japanese eyes was tensing up, ready to attack. "I want my friend back," said the Doctor. Jazz, thought the Doctor, is all about improvisation around a central theme. The musician creates spiral riffs within the framework of the rhythm. In the early days, when the white musicians caught on to jazz, the black musicians responded by escalating the complexity of the riffs, trying to stay one step ahead of their white contemporaries. Every jam session became a declaration of war. The virus, and by extension Fred, constantly improvised to achieve its objectives. The Doctor understood this, he operating in an identical manner. The question was, of him and Fred, who was better? The next 10 seconds, he thought, should decide that. The cake monster started its jump. The Doctor forced himself to stay in place. A single burst of coherent light drilled through its skull. It was a magnificent shot, considering that Kadiatu was sprinting at the time. She was by his side before the body hit the ground. "Is that the real Benny?" she asked. "Sort of," said the Doctor. Kadiatu raised her pistol. "Time to die," she said. Without taking his eyes off Benny Fred, the Doctor reached out and shoved Kadiatu off her feet. Killing Benny wouldn't even slow Fred down. The entire Artron energy reserve of the TARDIS hit him right between the shoulder blades. The Doctor let the power fill him up. In front of him, he saw Benny Fred struggle to react, but Fred was unused to the physical limitations of a human body. The Doctor had been counting on that. Just when he thought he was about to burst, he let the power go. Kadiatu picked herself up just in time to see the Doctor, Benny, and the gateway vanish in a brilliant wash of white light. When it subsided, the Doctor was standing alone. "Benny?" said the Doctor. "What the fuck was that?" said a voice. Kadiatu looked over and saw Lambarda climbing out from a tangle of debris. She pushed away the body of a cake monster as she got up. Credit Card followed her out. Kadiatu looked around, but couldn't see Blondie anywhere. She was going to ask Lambarda when the Doctor called her over. "Kadiatu, listen," said the Doctor. "I'm going in after Benny. If I don't come back, I want you to destroy all records of me, the history files, the opera, the lot." "Why?" "If I'm killed," he said, "it's better that I never existed at all." "I don't think going in there's a good idea," said Kadiatu. "She's my friend," said the Doctor. "Wish me luck." The Doctor ran towards the gateway and jumped. He passed through the interface and vanished. "Damn," said Kadiatu. "He shouldn't have done that," said Lambarda. "Don't tell me that," said Kadiatu. "No," said Lambarda. "I mean, the whole tunnel is going to collapse." "How long?" 32 seconds, said Credit Card. Kadiatu stared at the stunnel gateway. "Shit," she said, and threw herself in after the doctor.